I'll talk to Glenn Beck after a couple of thoughts from our Freedom File. The right to keep and bear arms was praised during our historic Tea Party summit on last week's show. It is the natural right of all persons to self-defense, and it's guaranteed by the Constitution. One controversial pro-gun argument is that the public needs guns not just to hunt or fend off ordinary criminals, but in part to deter rights violations by the government when it is taken over by tyrants. To some, that sounds like crazy militiaman talk. Well, tell that to the people of the United Kingdom, where the government just days ago issued an apology for the so-called Bloody Sunday massacre of peaceful Catholic Northern Irish protesters by murderous British soldiers. Governments really do commit violent crimes, and sometimes it takes them 38 years to admit it. Distrust of government probably explains why term limits on politicians keep getting more and more popular. A Rice University study suggests that support for term limits roughly doubled over the past decade, even though the Supreme Court had earlier declared state-by-state enactment of term limits on members of Congress unconstitutional. But remember, a constitutional amendment officially term-limiting presidents was enacted after FDR's presidency for life. With term limits a lot more popular than Congress is these days, maybe we'll one day see the runaway Congress term limited by an amendment. The fight to limit government is a favorite topic of my first guest, my Fox colleague, Glenn Beck. Glenn, it's breathtaking how far this White House is reaching in so many areas. Yeah, you just talked about term limits. I just shook my head. I thought, no way. I mean, here's a Congress that was afraid of the last president that we had, like Barack Obama, FDR. They waited until he was dead. People were frightened beyond belief on the overreach of FDR, and we're supposed to believe that he somehow or another was very, very popular, right. And yet they immediately enacted term limits, and yet then again didn't take the step on limiting their power as well. Well, it's very difficult to get people to limit their own power. You know that. Does the Congress recognize that we have inalienable rights that can't be taken away by a law they write or an edict the president issues? No. You know, and I know, Judge, I've been studying this now for the last few years, and progressivism, starting with Theodore Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson was the real kingpin on this, on administration. Right. They're administering everything and usurping the Constitution all the way around. I mean, when you have congressmen saying on the health care bill, we're creating rights, they've eliminated God and flipped our system completely upside down. This morning we learned that Joe Biden, when the president was speaking to the executives of BP, walked in the Oval Office and threatened the chair of BP. Give us the $20 billion or we'll take it. Where does he get that from? I have no idea. I had a friend write me and said he called the White House and said, where does the president get the authority? Where does the president get the authority? And this is a guy who can actually get through. He said he doesn't need it. He'll take it. Excuse me? You know, BP should be responsible, I think, and you probably agree with me, for all the damage it caused. But that doesn't give the government the right to seize BP assets and the government to distribute those assets as it sees fit. I tell you, it is frightening to me that we're becoming more and more Hugo Chavez-like every day that goes by. When you're talking about not only just taking and seizing the assets of BP, but now you're also talking about the same time, before you shut off the leak. I mean, this has been my argument about the border. Right. You want to worry about the border? Great. Let's worry about what we do with the people who are already here after we've turned off the flood. You've got to close the floodgates. You have all this oil pouring out, right. And he's immediately now talking about seizing the assets of BP, seizing control of BP, and then also saying, hey, by the way, we can fix this through tax increases in cap and trade. Fix the leak first. And why should he be demonizing BP in such a manner as to cause it to lose half of its value, $100 billion gone? Question, which is better, a wealthy BP that has the cash with which to fix the leak and repair the damage, or a poor BP that the government has to take over? What is your intent? Hey, I can answer that if you tell me what your intent is. If your intent is to fix the leak, to clean up the beaches, and to restore a free market system, a rich BP. If your intent is destroy capitalism,
and seize that company and use an emergency, a poor BP.
You know that the president and his people are going to use the BP catastrophe as an instrument to try and enact cap and trade, as an instrument to try and get the Greens to dominate everything that we do. Because we know that Rahm Emanuel has taught the president never let a crisis go to waste.
Well, that actually came from Colonel House,
Woodrow Wilson's guy.
Woodrow Wilson's guy, who said never let a good emergency go to waste. He learned this. The other thing that Woodrow Wilson learned, and this is fascinating to me because it's exactly being played out now. The other thing Woodrow Wilson realized at the end of World War I, that if you could just have the moral equivalent of war, you could get anything done. It's interesting to me that the president, first thing he did was get rid of the war on terror. We don't have a war on terror. It's an overseas contingency operation.
But we have a war on BP.
We have a war on BP. We have a war on an oil slick. We need to have war. He compared all of this to World War I. It is the progressive move. Look, George Bush was a progressive as well. All of the things that went away under George W. Bush, just at a much slower pace. We are in deep trouble here.
Earlier this week on the Glenn Beck program, I argued that the government told BP to drill in 5,000 feet of water instead of 500 feet of water, where the state of Louisiana said that they could drill. So they drilled in an area where no oil company has ever been able to monitor the flow. The federal government has never been able to tell them how to monitor the flow. And the law of the land gives them a liability cap. I think you could argue that the government is in large measure responsible for this mess.
You want to drill for oil. Why do it in 500 feet when you can do it in Montana? We have huge oil reserves onshore. The government is absolutely pushing us. The president is actually talking about peak oil. Well, I think you see, because they have to drill so far underneath the water that we're at peak oil. Are you kidding me? Let us drill onshore. You wouldn't have this problem.
Just to switch gears for a second, do you agree with me that we don't need a Department of Energy or a Department of Commerce or a Department of Education, and that clearly they're not authorized by the Constitution? What do we say to our liberal friends about who would manage this area of human behavior if those federal departments are gone?
People would. You tell me what we've gotten out of these things. What have we gotten? The Department of Energy has overseen this. That's what we've gotten. That's great. The Department of Education is overseeing our schools. They're failing miserably. What are we getting out of this? And you're not going to have much more to say to your liberal friends soon, because we don't have the money to do it anymore. The federal deficit is gone. The unfunded liabilities. And think of this.
Right.
They were $109 trillion. This week they've been upgraded, after we have health care, to $130 trillion.
What is your greatest fear about the government today in America?
That they will use an emergency to fundamentally transform this country into something that you won't recognize. That when all is said and done, they will need to control the people. Because the people will be hungry, the people will be frightened, and there will be a civil unrest, and not from the right. I think the president, you're already seeing it. The civil unrest in this country is coming from the extreme left. It always has. You have the extreme left that is popping up. Van Jones said, 2 weeks ago at this big think tank in Washington, D.C.,
right.
You've got to get out into the street. And you've got to force this president to do what he knows is right. They're talking about building civil unrest.
Unbelievable.